Battle of Worcester, King Charles II's epic escape, the oak tree that saved the king. Imagine this, a young king, just 21, stands amid the chaos of war. The hopes of a kingdom rest on his shoulders, but his army is outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. What led King Charles II to gamble everything on one desperate battle? Why did the once mighty Royalists face such crushing odds? And how did a towering 6'1" fugitive end up hiding in an oak tree, disguised as a servant, while Parliamentarian soldiers hunted him like a prized trophy? This is not just the story of a battle, it's the tale of a prince without a kingdom, a king without a crown, and the remarkable journey of survival that followed. What drove Charles to risk it all at Worcester? How did he outwit Oliver Cromwell's forces at every turn? And what bizarre twists of fate turned this escape into a legend that still echoes today? From the thunder of cannons to the rustle of leaves in a famous oak tree, join us as we uncover the Battle of Worcester, 1651, the dramatic last stand of the Royalists and the birth of a great chase through England's heartland. But the real question is, what happens when a king becomes a commoner? Watch until the end to find out how Charles II's wit, charm, and sheer luck changed the course of British history forever. The air in St. James's Palace was heavy with anticipation on the evening of May 29, 1630. A thunderstorm raged outside, as though the heavens themselves were announcing the arrival of a child who would one day face storms far greater than any nature could muster. Queen Henrietta Maria labored for hours, her cries echoing through the palace corridors. At last, just before midnight, a squalling infant entered the world. Charles Stuart, later King Charles II, was born into a family already on the precipice of catastrophe. Charles was the first surviving son of King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria, a French princess and sister to King Louis XIII. His lineage was impeccable, a blend of the powerful Stuart dynasty and the formidable Bourbon family. Yet, his mother's Catholicism made her an unpopular figure in Protestant England, a source of controversy that would cast long shadows over her son's life. Even at the moment of his birth, Charles's father was embroiled in a bitter struggle with Parliament. Charles I, an ardent believer in the divine right of kings, sought to impose his vision of absolute monarchy on a country increasingly skeptical of royal authority. His attempts to enforce religious uniformity across England, Scotland, and Ireland, favoring a moderate form of Protestantism, alienated large swaths of his subjects. It was a precarious world into which the newborn prince entered, one fraught with political strife and religious discord. Little did anyone suspect that this tiny infant, cradled in silks, would one day flee for his life, disguise himself as a commoner, and fight tooth and nail to reclaim a throne drenched in his father's blood. Charles's early years were spent in the gilded confines of royal palaces. As Duke of Cornwall and Rothesay, titles automatically bestowed upon him at birth, his every need was attended to by a fleet of governesses and tutors. In 1631, the Countess of Dorset took charge of his upbringing, and by 1638 he was formally created Prince of Wales, a title signaling his destiny as the future King of England. Despite his privileged upbringing, Charles's childhood was marred by the growing tensions between his father and Parliament. By the time Charles was 10, England was descending into chaos. In 1640, Charles I convened Parliament to raise funds to suppress the rebellious Scots in the so-called Bishops' Wars, conflict sparked by his attempt to impose Anglican reforms on Presbyterian Scotland. But instead of granting funds, Parliament demanded sweeping reforms, igniting a struggle that spiraled into the English Civil War. In 1642, the unthinkable happened. Charles I declared war on his own Parliament. As cannons roared and swords clashed across England, young Charles was thrust into the heart of the conflict. While his mother fled to France with his younger siblings, Charles remained by his father's side. In 1645, at just 14 years old, he was entrusted with commanding the Royalist forces in the West Country, a region teetering on the edge of rebellion. Under the guidance of advisors like the Duke of Richmond and Edward Hyde, Charles began learning the brutal realities of leadership. But the Royalist cause was crumbling. The pivotal defeat at the Battle of Naseby that summer left the king's forces shattered. By 1646, With his father a prisoner of the Scots, young Charles fled to France, joining his mother in exile. Exile was a bitter pill for Charles. At the French court, he reunited with his mother, who was tireless in her efforts to rally support for the Royalist cause. But France was embroiled in its own turmoil, and European monarchs were wary of entangling themselves in England's civil war. Charles became a pawn in his father's desperate diplomacy, dangled as a potential husband for various princesses in exchange for military aid. In 1649, the unthinkable happened. On January 30th, Charles I was executed by Parliament, his head severed on a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. News of the regicide reached Charles in The Hague, where he had been preparing to return to Britain. His grief was profound, but his resolve hardened. 2 days later, the Scots proclaimed him King Charles II. After the execution of his father, Charles I, 2 days later, the young Charles II was crowned King of Scotland in 1651. His Scottish allies, led by David Leslie, believed they had found in Charles a rallying point to unify Britain under the Royalist banner. However, Charles had grander visions. Why fight only in Scotland when the real prize, England, beckoned? The campaign into the heart of England would not only raise the banner of monarchy, but could potentially rally discontented English Presbyterians and old Royalists to his cause. David Leslie, the commander of the Scottish Army, had reservations about this ambitious plan. A veteran of both the 30 Years' War and the Scottish Covenanter campaigns, Leslie was pragmatic and cautious. Born into the powerful Leslie family, he had grown up steeped in military tradition. But for all his brilliance, his loyalty to the Covenanter cause tethered him to a king he suspected was gambling with more than his crown. Charles, however, was resolute. He believed his alliance with the Covenanters, underscored by his signing of the Solemn League and Covenant, would convince English Presbyterians to support him against Cromwell's independence. With this hope, Charles and his 16,000-strong army, an uneasy mix of Scots and Royalist remnants, marched south in August 1651, covering an astonishing 150 miles in just over a week. The Royalist force was varied as it was ambitious. Scottish clans, veterans of Leslie's campaigns, mingled with Loyalist English cavalry and infantry. Leading them were notable commanders. David Leslie, the cautious general, a master of defensive warfare but wary of overextending. The Duke of Hamilton, a staunch Royalist who had witnessed the failure of earlier expeditions. Major General Montgomery, a seasoned soldier tasked with defending key crossings. Sir Edward Massey, once a Parliamentarian governor, now a turncoat Royalist who hoped to galvanize his fellow Presbyterians in the West. Despite this impressive lineup, the army suffered from internal divisions and logistical strains. The march south mirrored the ill-fated 1648 expedition of the Duke of Hamilton, whose army had disintegrated under similar conditions. On August 8th, as the Royalists rested near Penrith and Kendal, they made a crucial error, failing to secure their supply lines or account for Cromwell's inevitable pursuit. Oliver Cromwell, ever the calculating general, was not idle. Informed by spies and sympathizers, he tracked every move of Charles's army. On August 7th, Cromwell called out the local militias, mobilizing 14,000 London-trained bands and directing every suspected Royalist to be closely monitored. Arms hidden in country estates were confiscated and key strongholds fortified. To harass the Royalists, Cromwell dispatched Lieutenant General John Lambert with a cavalry corps and positioned Major General Thomas Harrison at Newcastle to assemble mounted troops. Meanwhile, Cromwell himself marched with a force hardened by victory in Scotland, covering an impressive 20 miles a day in sweltering heat. By August 19th, his army reached Ferrybridge, with Lambert and Harrison blocking Royalist movements to the north and west. By August 22nd, Charles's army reached Worcester, a city rich in symbolic value but poor in strategic advantage. Resting his troops for 5 days, a decision born of necessity but fraught with risk, Charles hoped for reinforcements that never materialized. The Royalists' presence in England, far from rallying support, had alienated many who saw the Scottish army as a foreign invader. Step into history's most thrilling moments, feel the courage, heartbreak, and ambition that shaped our world. Here on our channel, we don't just tell stories, We bring them to life, sparking curiosity, wonder, and excitement in every episode. By subscribing and turning on notifications, you're not only joining a community of history lovers, you're supporting deeper dives, bolder content, and the chance to experience history like never before. Together, let's keep these stories alive and growing. Subscribe now and be part of this incredible journey. You won't want to miss a single moment. Cromwell seized the opportunity. With 2-to-1 numerical superiority, he prepared for the final blow. On August 30th, his engineers built 2 pontoon bridges over the Severn and Teme rivers, securing vital crossing points. Meanwhile, Colonel Robert Lilburne crushed a detachment of Royalist reinforcements at Wigan Lane, cutting off any chance of reinforcements for Charles. At dawn, Cromwell unleashed his attack. Fleetwood, commanding the western flank, crossed the pontoon bridge over the Teme, forcing his way into St. John's, the city's western suburb. Colonel Richard Deane struggled initially at Powick Bridge, but eventually broke through after fierce fighting. The Royalists, commanded by Colonel Keith, contested every hedge and field, but were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. From the tower of Worcester Cathedral, Charles watched the battle unfold. Spotting an opportunity, he ordered 2 desperate sorties. The Duke of Hamilton led an assault from St. Martin's Gate, striking the Parliamentarian line at Perry Wood, while Charles himself led a charge against the exposed eastern flank. For a brief moment, the Royalists gained ground, but David Leslie, stationed at Pitchcroft Meadow, failed to support these efforts, a decision that remains shrouded in controversy. Cromwell, sensing danger, personally led reinforcements across the pontoon bridge. With the addition of these seasoned troops, the Parliamentarians turned the tide, forcing the Royalists back into the city. As darkness fell, Cromwell's forces stormed Worcester from 3 directions. The Essex militia captured Fort Royal, turning the Royalist cannons on the city. Inside, chaos reigned. Charles, realizing the battle was lost, shed his armor and fled through St. Martin's Gate, narrowly escaping capture thanks to a desperate cavalry charge led by the Earl of Cleveland and Major Carolus. The defeat was total. Over 3,000 Royalists were killed and 10,000 captured, including much of the Scottish leadership. The countryside, once a haven for Royalists, turned against them, with locals capturing fleeing soldiers for reward. As Cromwell's forces tightened their iron grip on England, Charles faced a bounty of £1,000 on his head, a fortune at the time, declared by Parliament. This sum wasn't for a tea date. It was a price for betrayal, treason, and most certainly his head on a spike. With no time to sulk over his dashed hopes, Charles fled the city of Worcester under cover of night, accompanied by a ragtag band of Loyalists. What followed was a 6-week odyssey of deception, danger, and daring escapes that would cement his legend as one of the greatest escape artists of all time. Charles's first significant stop was Boscobel House, a safe house owned by the Penderell family, loyal Catholics who specialized in helping fugitives. With Parliamentarian patrols hot on his heels, Charles did something no monarch would ordinarily contemplate. He climbed into a tree. But not just any tree. It was a sprawling oak tree, whose thick canopy shielded him from detection as Cromwell's soldiers searched the surrounding woods. For a whole day, the future king remained perched in its branches, reportedly watching his pursuers pass beneath him, likely muttering, "If only they'd look up." The Royal Oak, as it would later be called, became a symbol of Stuart loyalty and defiance. The tree's fame grew so immense that pubs across England began adopting its name, and even today, its descendants are cherished. After leaving Boscobel, Charles adopted a clever disguise, a lowly servant accompanying Jane Lane, a bold and resourceful Royalist sympathizer. Charles, a towering 6'1" figure, a virtual skyscraper in the 17th century, stuck out like a sore thumb in his new role as William Jackson, Jane's groom. The plan was simple: travel openly and inconspicuously through hostile territory to find a ship that would ferry him to safety. But traveling incognito proved harder than it looked. At one checkpoint, they encountered a group of Parliamentarian soldiers who were a little too inquisitive. When asked his trade, Charles calmly replied that he was a simple country boy, likely praying they wouldn't notice his regal bearing or his overly practiced manners. His height, however, was harder to disguise. "You're quite the tall groom," one soldier remarked. Charles smiled. I, tall enough to carry trouble on my shoulders. The soldiers let them pass, oblivious to the royal fugitive in their midst. After narrowly avoiding capture numerous times, Charles finally boarded a ship in Brighton on October 15, 1651, bound for France. The voyage was fraught with peril, stormy seas and the ever-present threat of discovery, but Charles finally arrived in French territory the next day. England was left to Cromwell, whose iron rule reshaped the nation. Once in Paris, Charles reunited with his mother, Queen Henrietta Maria, in the Louvre Palace, then a royal residence, not the art haven we know today. Far from a glamorous reunion, their life in exile was marked by poverty. Charles was penniless, relying on a small pension from Henrietta's relatives. The French court largely ignored them, focused instead on their own intrigues. Desperate for support, Charles toyed with the idea of converting to Catholicism, reasoning that it might attract aid from the Pope and Catholic monarchs. Henrietta even pressured her younger son, James, to convert. Despite these efforts, aid was not forthcoming. In 1654, war broke out between the English Commonwealth and Spain, creating new opportunities for Charles. Negotiations with the Spanish viceroy allowed Charles to relocate his court to the Spanish Netherlands, where he gained modest backing. Yet his exile remained a whirlwind of personal indiscretions. Charles fathered numerous illegitimate children with various mistresses, sowing seeds of scandal for years to come. Oliver Cromwell's death in 1658 marked a turning point. His son, Richard Cromwell, proved utterly incapable of maintaining control, earning the nickname Tumbledown Dick. By 1659, Parliament was reconvened, but the fractured state of the Commonwealth created an opening for Royalist sympathizers. Entered General George Monk, the wily governor of Scotland, who began to advocate for the restoration of the monarchy. In April 1660, Charles issued the Declaration of Breda, promising religious tolerance, amnesty for his enemies, and payment for the army in exchange for his restoration. The declaration was widely distributed, creating a groundswell of support. On May 29, 1660, his 30th birthday, Charles triumphantly returned to London. Crowds lined the streets to welcome him, showering him with cheers and flowers. The restoration of the monarchy marked the end of England's republican experiment and the beginning of a new Stuart era. Charles was crowned in 1661, cementing his reputation as the Merry Monarch, a king who had escaped death, outwitted his enemies, and regained his throne with a charm that would define his reign. Charles's story of escape and resilience remains one of history's most remarkable tales. From hiding in an oak tree to reclaiming his crown, his journey was nothing short of spectacular, a blend of wit, determination, and sheer luck that shaped the destiny of a nation. Charles's journey from a gilded cradle to a battlefield defeat taught him invaluable lessons about resilience, diplomacy, and the precarious nature of power. When he finally reclaimed the throne in 1660 during the Restoration, he governed with a newfound pragmatism, balancing his authority with the realities of a divided kingdom. Thank you for joining us on this epic journey through the life of Charles II and the Battle of Worcester. Don't miss out on more captivating stories from history. Follow us, subscribe, and click the notification button to stay updated. History has never been this fascinating.